Okay. The HK West Maui Community Fund thanks you all for participating in the event this evening. We'd like to remind participants to consider enjoying Maui Mele, supporting Na Leo Kalele, the West Maui Kaiapuni Auxiliary organization, by purchasing either of the Leina Honua Pi'ilani albums, either the Songs of West Maui or Na Mele Ho, available digitally as well as at mele.com. And also just want to note that there's another HK Fund project that was recently nominated for a Grammy Award, Lovely Sunrise, performed by Nawai'eha. And that's also available digitally and at mele.com. So hopefully you can enjoy some Maui Mele during the season. And thank you, Kanani and Lorenz. Aloha.
Aloha, Vilina mai kako. Mahalo everyone for joining us this evening. Since 2018, the Iconic Maui Cultural Center has been hosting the free public HK West Maui Community Fund Kanaka Scholars Lecture Series. The series is co-sponsored by HK West Maui Community Fund, the University of Hawaii Maui College Hawaiian Studies Department, and the Ku'e Petition. The lectures occur monthly. The series features a host of new established scholars and innovators and their research and work on Hawaii and Hawaiian communities and abroad. We proudly present this to you via Zoom and live through HK West Maui's Facebook page. Tonight's presentation, Recentering Hawaii in Oceania from Hōkuleʻa to Kaʻimiloa and back. Dr. Gonschor teaches at the University of French Polynesia in Punaia, Tahiti. He received his doctoral degree in political science from the University of Hawaii and is fluent in at least 5 languages. Virtual round of applause for Dr. Lorenz Gonschor. Mahalo.
Aloha mai kako. Thank you very much, Kanani, for introducing me. Also thanks to Lance and Bianca for helping me set this up, for inviting me. Yeah, today, as Kanani already said, I just a little bit more about myself first. My name is Lorenz Gonschor. I am originally from Germany. I have lived in Hawaii, though, for more than 15 years, from the early 2000s till about a couple of years to 2017, I think. Did most of my studies there, and have been very interested for these last almost 20 years in the connections of Hawaii and the rest of the Pacific. Like I've always been very interested in the Pacific islands and all these different connections there for a very long time. And so, as Kani said, I got my doctoral degree at the University of Hawaii a couple of years ago, and then after that, I've been teaching for 2 years in Tonga, in a small university named Atenisi. And now, since this year, I am in Tahiti at the University here of French Polynesia. So just a little bit more about this background. And what I'm going to talk about today is, let me share my screen. I hope that will work. Let's see where we are. So now, can you all see the screen now? Does it work now? Just a thumbs up.
Yes, it seems to work.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure, because the technology is always tricky. I've had all kind of things happen to me to these things before. Okay, so my talk today, which I titled "Recentering Hawaii in Oceania: From the Kaʻimiloa to the Hōkuleʻa and Back." So if this was a live event, I would probably ask in the audience, people put your fingers up, how many of you know the Hōkuleʻa? And probably the answer would most of you, because I mean, that's such an iconic vessel for everybody in Hawaii knows that, essentially. But then I would also ask how many of you have heard about the Kaʻimiloa, and I would assume that probably a few people know, but it's probably much less well known. And the Kaʻimiloa is as a ship that is, I guess, more Western in shape, as you can see. But nonetheless, it even though it has a pretty much a Western shape, it was actually used for kind of a very similar purpose to the Hōkuleʻa 1 century earlier, namely to reconnect Hawaii with the other islands of Oceania. This was the flagship of the Royal Hawaiian Navy under King Kalakaua, and was sent down to Samoa, and that played a quite important role there. And I will get to that in my major part of my presentation down a few slides. But essentially, the point I wanted to make is that Hawaii really has an important role, did have an important role to play in Oceania, in the Pacific as a whole, and it also increasingly does this again today, and that there's this kind of reconnection with Hawaii and other islands of Oceania is happening as we speak. So and I want to kind of give this kind of a more of a historical background to this Pan-Pacific connection. Okay, next slide. So of course, the most important thing here is that Hawaii really needs to be recentered in Oceania, when in fact the popular image of Hawaii that we have right now, that most of you learned in school, that is not centered in Oceania. Like the popular image is that Hawaii is a tourist paradise that's part of the US and it's somewhere off the coast of the US. I mean, you have most of the maps, it's not even clear where exactly it is. It's usually an inset somewhere in an American map. And if you're lucky, it's there, and it's kind of generally into the direction where it is, to the southeast of California. In some maps, it's even worse. They have it in the inset in the Gulf of Mexico, then you don't even know anything of where it is. But nonetheless, it's always kind of seen as this appendage of the US that's somewhere kind of out in the Pacific, but not clearly defined. And so part of what's really important and what I see as the kuleana of my work, and of course of many other scholars, is to kind of rectify this wrong impression and to recenter Hawaii, really put it really where it is, namely in the center of the Northern Pacific. And in order to do that, we look into source materials. We look into how Hawaiians in the 19th century saw their islands. And here's a good example of that is the map that is titled Aina Moana, meaning the lands of the sea islands. And that was in the first school atlas printed in Lahainaluna in 1840. So there you see a very different perspective. Also, if you look at that school atlas, it starts with that map. That's the first map. The first map is not even the Hawaiian Islands. The first map is this one. And then you have the Hawaiian Islands, you have details of various Oahu, Maui, whatever. And then eventually you get to other continents. You go to Europe, to United States, to Asia, like you have the rest of the world in there too. But the perspective is very different. It's not the US and then an appendage called Hawaii, but it's Oceania, zoom into the Northern Pacific where Hawaii is, and then get the rest of the world. To kind of jump ahead from between various parts of history, but I'm trying to make a coherent discourse, but that still jumps in time here. If we fast forward about 150 years from that Lahaina Atlas into the 1990s, we have a very important scholar from Tonga by the name of Epeli Hau'ofa, and some of you might know about him. He is probably most famous for his essay that he wrote in 1993, which was entitled Our Sea of Islands. And so in this one, he argues that there has been this kind of wrong impression created by Western colonialism that because all the colonizers came from big continents and they looked down onto the Pacific islands as these small islands that are kind of lost in the far sea and that are unimportant because they're small and they're kind of lost and it takes forever to get there, and like this whole kind of diminutive discourse, when in fact he said, no, we should actually see the ocean as a space that connects the islands. And if we look at it from that point of view, then we'll have, instead of a small islands lost in the sea, we have our Sea of Islands. We have a large, well, actually not just a large, the largest maritime civilization that the world has ever seen. That stretches throughout the entire Pacific. Everybody is somehow connected. The Austronesian languages are spoken all the way, even into the Indian Ocean, all the way to Madagascar, of course, here in the Pacific. So this is kind of the content of that of Hau'ofa's discourse. But the reason I'm putting this picture from the island of Hawaii here is because he actually describes in his essay that he had this vision, this epiphany that led him to write this essay when he was driving the road from Hilo to Kona or the other side, I forgot. But he was driving in this area and he saw the two mauna, and that was really what impressed him, and that was kind of the mana of these two Hawaiian Mauna that made him think about how great really Oceania is. So again, this is just like, again, a vision in the 20th century of Greater Oceania born in Hawaii, which again, comes back to what I talked about before. But now let's jump again back into 1,000 years before that. What really originally inspired all of this, and that of course is this amazing world of traditional Oceanian voyaging that, as I said before, it's the Polynesian Triangle. We know that, but it's actually even much further than that. It goes all the way to Indonesia and the people there, and then it goes on the other side of the world, the entire Indian Ocean. People from Indonesia settling Madagascar, which is another couple thousand miles across that ocean as well. So it's like a huge maritime civilization that, in long before any other civilization developed seafaring. I mean, the Europeans started with Columbus, and he didn't even know where he was going. He just happened to, and he thought he was in India. You know what I mean? So that's kind of, and Oceanian people were doing this 2,000 years before that. 1500 BC, people were already all over. They were already spread from East Africa all the way to what's now Samoa or Tonga, and then by about 1000 AD, they were even on the coast of South America. So that's really that's what a great maritime civilization is. And one example, like one small fragment of kind of directly transmitting that knowledge into kind of European hands during that period of first contact is this interesting document. I don't know, again, wondering how many of you in Hawaii are aware of that. Here in Tahiti, fortunately, people are now very much aware of it because recently there was a lot of it published about that. Tupaia was a Tahitian traditional navigator, priest, like Tahua or Kahuna. He had a lot of that knowledge, and when he helped Captain Cook to find his way in, like, between Tahiti and some of the neighboring islands. Cook recruited him to be on his board to kind of, I guess, advise him on finding islands. And then Cook asked him to draw a map of like all the islands he knew, and then that way Tupaia drew this map, and it's very complicated to read because he can't use it. Tupaia created kind of a new system. He used some of the traditional ways of pointing out islands and kind of hybridized it with the Western concept of drawing lines on a map that he saw in Captain Cook's study. But so it's kind of, it's really relatively complicated to read it, but once you figure out how to read it, it shows pretty much the entire Polynesian Triangle, all of the islands all the way from Hawaii is there. The island that's called Oahuroa, that's right there on the upper left corner. That's Oahu, right? That's the Hawaiian Islands. And then you have everything. You have Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, all of Eastern Polynesia, all the way to Rapa Nui. Like, it's pretty much everything is on that map. And that shows you like the amount of knowledge that people had before the Europeans came. And then of course this, the diseases happened, like just like in Hawaii, people died, and missionaries came, told people that their traditional knowledge was not valuable, and so on and so forth. Like, we had pretty much kind of similar processes everywhere. And then much of this knowledge got lost till we had only like small pockets, like, and we'll come to that later, like people like Papa Mau, a handful of islands here and there, in other parts that had still fragments of that knowledge. But by the time of Western contact, that was there. There were like probably a couple hundred people in the Pacific who had this kind of knowledge that Tupaia shared on this map. So just wanted to recall that, like, in all of the debate that we're in, all of what we are going to look into from the 19th century, we also have to keep in mind that that's really where, that's kind of the traditional culture from where these people are coming. So now we go into really the core of my own research, what I did from my dissertation and also from my book. That was mainly like research in the archives about the last 150, 200 years, or like mainly the 19th century. And so I want to highlight a few of the things that I found in the archives about these trans-Pacific connections during the 19th century. And so let's start here with early in the 19th century, these pan-Pacific connections between Hawaii and Tahiti. That was really kind of the, I would say, like post-contact, kind of the first written connections that are well documented. Is that from the time that people started to read and write in Hawaiian and in Tahitian, and then later in other languages, they started to write letters to each other. And even if it might have been some of the missionaries' purpose to divide people from each other, but nonetheless, they also used this tool of writing to write to each other. And some of these Eastern Polynesian languages are so close to each other that actually, if you're a native speaker and you write in either Hawaiian or Tahitian, it's pretty easy to figure out what you're saying to each other. And that's what these people did. So here we have some of the oldest documents I found, a letter from Kamehameha III to Kamehameha II, Liholiho to Tehewiti of Huahine, a chief in one of the outer islands of Tahiti. And then here another very interesting document, that's the clearance of a Tahitian registered ship owned by a Hawaiian, William Calais, in the early 1840s. So again, this is something that also often doesn't really get appreciated, that, you know, this European influences came, Western ships came, but a lot of islanders were also very quick at catching up these new technologies. And there were a lot of not just sailors on these ships, there were also a lot of captains and even owners of Western style ships in the 19th century who were native Pacific Islanders, native Hawaiians, native Tahitians, and others. So this is like one example here. And the little flag there, that's how the Tahitian flag looked like, the flag of the Tahitian kingdom under the Pomares. Then, of course, in the 40s, we got into a kind of trouble because both the French and the British were trying to, it was a kind of the first wave of imperialism. And the Tahiti was kind of besieged by the French. French Navy tried to take it over. And then Queen Pomare IV wrote a letter to Kauikeauli, to King Kamehameha III. And then Kamehameha III replied, pretty much expressing his solidarity, saying, well, I can't really, I don't have a navy to send to help you to kick the French out, but, you know, here's my, I'm supporting you. If things get too hot, you can just come here and I can grant you exile in Hawaii. So definitely like very close friendship and statements of solidarity here. These documents are both in the Hawaii archives and the state archives. So both the letters sent back and forth. Now then, of course, one thing that now becomes important is that whereas Tahiti ended up being essentially screwed over by the French in this process, the French took Tahiti over in the 1840s. And as we speak, Tahiti is still a French colony. But in Hawaii, the 1840s actually had the exact opposite outcome, even though the British and the French were also somewhat aggressive, but because of very brilliant Hawaiian diplomacy, Hawaii was actually able to reverse the situation and most of you probably know this, that Hawaiian diplomats Ha'alilio and Timothy Ha'alilio and his assistant William Richards went to Britain and France and were actually negotiating in a quite smart way, kind of playing those big powers off against each other, until eventually the British and the French on November 28, 1843 agreed to recognize Hawaii as an independent state. So that was a very tremendous success for Hawaii. And what you see here is a flyer like for the 40th anniversary of that. The 30th anniversary, 1873. So it was like Laku Oko'a, the national holiday, based on this international recognition that Hawaii was granted. And so Hawaii then, in the second half of the 19th century, really had this unique political position to be the only country in Oceania to be recognized by the Western powers as their equal, at least formally, diplomatically. And again, to back that up here, I have another primary source. I have a map that was made in Germany in 1859. And that one shows Hawaii as, I'm zooming in here, as one of the 7, what they considered major powers in the Pacific, you have Britain, Russian, and so on and so forth, French, and so on. But then down there you have the Reich Kamehamehas, Reich meaning the empire. So the empire of the Kamehamehas was considered like one of the powers of the Pacific, even though of course smaller than like Britain or France or anything like that. But nonetheless, so this was like a tremendous success that Hawaii had, and subsequently Hawaii would then use this position to to help other islands of Oceania, and other islands of Oceania would look up to Hawaii as a model, because if Hawaii could do it, then other islanders should be able to do it too. Yeah, so here's again the zoom. Sorry, should have clicked that before about that. Now, and this is really like at the core of my research that I put in my book. This is just a picture of my book that I published just last year. Paperback came out this year, so it's much more reasonable price now for students and others to buy. What I'm talking about in this book is this kind of mainly tracing this idea of what I call pan-Oceanianism, this idea of unifying all these islands into one big confederation, and like the role that the Hawaiian Kingdom played in promoting this idea. And actually, this was really for the first time really envisioned in this modern sense of kind of creating a confederation of nations in the 1850s. And the person who was at the forefront of this was the diplomatic representative of Hawaii, Charles St. Julian, who had an office in Sydney, at that time a British colony in Australia. And in one of his writings, the official report of Central Polynesia, which he wrote to the Foreign Ministry in Honolulu, he had this, he expressed this kind of vision that Hawaii would be and that I'm quoting him here, a power in the world. And that's the term I also use for my book. So, here you have this idea that, if Oceania really bonds together, despite this new situation where islanders are no longer alone in their ocean, there's now these intruders from Europe and from America, these colonizers, these imperial powers. But nonetheless, if now in this new situation, Oceania adopts Western technology and then bonds together and forms a huge confederation, then Oceania will still be a power in the world. It will actually be, just like Hawaii as a small kingdom already has achieved it. But once we extend this, create an Oceanian confederation, then we are really a power in the world. So that's kind of that's the idea here. And I will now share a few primary sources that I found to back this up or to support this further. Also, of course, I forgot my last point, that it was St. Julian in the 50s who formulated the idea, and then the one who really implemented it was King Kalakaua between 1874 and 1887. Now, one of the outcome of this is also that you can establish a sort of constitutional genealogies, namely that the Hawaiian Constitution of 1864, of which you see here the Hawaiian version and the English version, became as a model for the constitutions of Fiji. That's the first one here in Fijian, Aʻiawu-Nilawa. And then Tonga, that's the one at the furthest to the right in 1875, and then also partially for that of Samoa, which is the one, the handwritten copy there, which says Lefa Awai. So all these constitutions that these other island nation states tried to, they were trying to build constitutional governments, and they were essentially building them based or modeled on the Hawaiian Kingdom and on this 1864 constitution of Hawaii. And now while Tonga and while Samoa and Fiji were taken over by colonial powers and went through a different kind of route of colonization and then later decolonization, Tonga is a very interesting case because Tonga actually still has this constitution that is, still to this day about, 70, 80% or so identical with that of Hawaii. So because Tonga was never formally colonized, it was just put under British protectorate, but internally the political structure always stayed like that. So today we have this heritage from this legacy all the way till today in one Pacific country. Now again, don't want to go into all the details here, but this is some of my research that I did in more details to look into how all these different Pacific islands in the 19th century, partly based on earlier connections, but kind of reinvigorating them in the 19th century, how they served as each other's models, and how various constitutional systems, legal systems, political ideas, structural ideas, pretty much everything having to do with kind of a modern style governance were borrowed from each other. And there's first in Tahiti, there was a lot of influence that went into other islands, but then mainly from Hawaii, and then also from Tonga partly. So it's quite a very intriguing networks there that of political institutions and constitutional structures being borrowed by each other. Okay, now I want to just highlight a few very specific examples of letters, primary sources between island rulers here. The first part with Hawaii and Fiji and Western Polynesia. So here we have one of the earliest ones is a letter from King Dakombau of Fiji to Kamehameha V of Hawaii. Essentially telling him, I want to model, trying to build a constitutional monarchy, and, I want to use Hawaii as an example, and I want formal official relations. Then Kamehameha V writes them back. This one I had to go in the Fiji National Archives to find it. So, 19th century people didn't make Xerox copies. Xerox machines didn't exist. So often in order to do these, to reconstruct these conversations, you have to be at, various parts of the world to go to the archives to find these puzzle these conversations together. And that's part of what I did here. They continue to talk to each other. And the conversation then continues under the monarchs after Lunalilo and Kalakaua all the way till 1874. Then the British, with a gunboat diplomacy, they come to Fiji and they take it over. Fiji becomes a British colony. Of course, Hawaii doesn't have the force to prevent the British from doing that, but nonetheless, we had this 4 years of very intense conversation and attempt to build a kind of nation state similar to Hawaii, like an indigenous-led native state. Indigenous-led nation state in order to prevent colonization there. Now, similar story in Samoa in 1875, the Ta'imua, that's the leading chiefs of Samoa, they sent a letter to King Kalakaua, and they essentially asking Kalakaua to recognize them. And then this is the letter here in the state archives. They also attached the Samoan constitution, which again is in itself based on the Hawaiian example. So even before they started this conversation, they already saw copies of the Hawaiian Constitution. I don't know exactly how, probably sailors bringing it there, or I don't know, but it was that awareness was already there. And then Kalakaua responds, and he then formally recognizes the Samoan government. That's his official letter of recognition. And then as a next step, the Ta'imua, the chiefs of Samoa, they have hired an American diplomat, Albert Steinberger, who serves as their main advisor, and he then, in their name, started negotiating with Kalakaua to negotiate a friendship treaty. Now, unfortunately, this at that time didn't work out, because in Samoa there was a lot of trouble there, a lot of internal strifes, various chiefly factions against each other, and also the Western powers already there, the Germans mainly, the British and the Americans, kind of pitting one chief against another and kind of creating chaos there, because they don't want a strong native state, Samoan state, to emerge. They want to have this kind of unstable situation where one chief fights another, so they can buy land and steal stuff and exploit the country. So this chaos, this very chaotic situation, remains in Samoa for quite a long time. And then in 1887, King Kalakaua then picks up that struggle again. He finally sends actually a full team of diplomats to Hawaii, and that's where the Kaʻimiloa comes into play. Like Kalakaua then commissions a warship, sends a Hawaiian ambassador and his assistant. So what you see on this picture is it's actually aboard this ship. You have in the center King Malietoa of Samoa. And then next to him you have John Ailuena Bush, the Hawaiian ambassador, who some of you might know as also a newspaper editor. He was very active in resisting the Dole regime in the 1890s. This whole Hui Aloha Aina, he was very actively involved in that. And he's also famous for publishing one of the stories of Hi'iaka Ikapoliopele in the Hawaiian newspaper. So he's like a very multi-talented Hawaiian cultural and political leading figure in the late 19th century. So he was the ambassador to Samoa. And then next to him you have his assistant, the secretary Henry Pua, the one who has all these orders. And then on the other side you have another two Hawaiian Navy officers too. So you essentially you have the entire the Hawaiian Kingdom sends a full-on kind of display of its status as a small but nonetheless existing power there. And then they actually do then sign a Treaty of Confederation in February of 1887. This is the original here, and from the State Archives with the signature of King Malietoa and various other Samoan high chiefs. And so this is now really the first step that they create this Pan-Oceanian Confederation. They then want to also, as a next step, then Bush and Poor are supposed to go to Tonga and to various other islands in the Pacific too. And of course, here we have these main artifacts, the main kind of instruments, I guess, and symbols of this. You have the Hawaiian Navy ship Kaʻimiloa. That's, I think, still in the Hawaiian Islands before they leave to go down to Samoa. And King Kalakaua also creates this Royal Order of the Star of Oceania, Kahuku Oceania, and that order is then going to be presented to Malietoa and to all these other different chiefs and kings in the South Pacific in order to make them kind of, make them formally peers to King Kalakaua and kind of induce them into this confederation. Now we have in Tonga, we have also some very interesting close relations here. We have in 1880 King George Tupou I, who through his Minister of Foreign Affairs initiates negotiations for a treaty of friendship with Hawaii. Here you see that letter. That's also from the State Archives. And then Kalakaua responds positively. They start this negotiation, but then again, there's some trouble there. Tonga has also internal problems. They don't really follow through. And then in 86, Kalakaua again signs a letter, and this is, unfortunately, we only have a typescript copy here, not the original. But so that one, he again proposes to negotiate a treaty of friendship, and also invites Tupou I to formally join this confederation that they already have with Samoa. Now, unfortunately, it didn't go through, neither that one, and then the one in Samoa was didn't really hold for long either, because what happened in 1887, I would now ask the people in the audience, 1887 Hawaii, well, most of you probably know that was when that first coup by the missionary descendants, Dole and company, happened, a so-called bayonet coup, where they forced King Kalakaua to sign a constitution that would take away most of his powers, would also take away most of the voting powers of Kanaka Oiwi in the kingdom. And with this kind of coup and this kind of takeover of most of the power by the white missionary descendants, this whole policy was then terminated. Actually, the new cabinet with Thurston and all these people in it, they then formally recalled the Hawaiian ambassadors to, Kaʻimiloa was called back, everything. This whole thing was decommissioned, and because obviously they didn't want that. Dole and Thurston, all these people, they wanted Hawaii to, have relations with the United States, but not with Hawaii's natural allies and cousins in the South, that they wanted to cut that connection off. And as we know, they have, well, I mean, at least for the time being, they have succeeded pretty well for like several decades. Now, I just want to briefly mention also, before I come back to the follow-up, that there was also a networking involved with Micronesia here. I just want to point it out because there's so much negative stuff nowadays about the relationship with Micronesians in Hawaii, so much ungratefulness and viciousness by certain people in Hawaii against people from Micronesia, which I think is very, very unfortunate. And I mean, just to make one little contribution to counter this, is just want to make sure that, of course, we know that there was Papa Mau, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but even before that, in the 19th century, there were connections between Hawaii and Micronesia. The first document here is a letter by Kauikeauli to all the chiefs of the islands in the Great Ocean to the westward, meaning to all the different kings and chiefs of Micronesia. And that was when there were Hawaiian missionaries who were also being sent to these islands. So this is the first letter, and it was delivered to the Tokoshra, the King Lupalik I of the island of Kosrae in 1852. So there we have kind of the first documented like 19th century kind of written exchange of connection between Hawaii and Micronesia. And then in the 1880s, it was very intense also between the Uea, or kings of the islands of Hutaritari and Abayang, and then other different islands in the Gilbert Islands, or what is now called Kiribati. So there again, we had a lot of very close connections, and I don't want to go into all the details here, but it's a very interesting series of connections there too. This is Tembinoka, another king of Uea, another a leader of one of these atolls in Kiribati. So, you know, just always keep that in mind before saying anything bad about Micronesians or anything. You know, always think about this was like, you know, this was the Micronesians and Hawaiians were seeing each other as brother peoples, as sister peoples, as cousins back in the 19th century, and they were seeing themselves like that in the 20th century too, with Papa Mau and the Hōkuleʻa. So, you know, what is all this Micronesian bashing today? It's just awful and absolutely, like, you know, unacceptable today. Anyway, back to Tahiti. Now, because, you know, being based in Tahiti, I of course very specifically dear to my heart to see these connections. In November of 1887, this is very interesting here. This is something that's not very well known in Hawaii, that even though Tahiti was now under the French, King Pomare V, who was had still the title of king, even though he had been forced to formally abandon his kingdom to the French. But nonetheless, he expected King Kalakaua to visit him. So there was apparently a planned trip to Tahiti, maybe also to other islands in the Pacific. And so for that reason, because Pomare V expected to be awarded also this Order of the Star of Oceania, he then asked the French government to whether they would grant him permission to create his own Royal Order of Pomare so he could reciprocate something to King Kalakaua. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't, the French kind of denied it. They said, well, you're no longer king, so we won't grant you that. And then King Kalakaua also never came, probably because of the bayonet situation, and just like if he had left Hawaii during that time, you know, they probably would have like just not let him go back, or, you know, or he would have just like died the way that he died in 91 when he did go away to San Francisco. Anyway, so he was very smart, certainly, for him not to go during this time when the bayonet people were in power. But nonetheless, it's very important to know that there was, you know, these conversations went on. They also went on even after the overthrow. This is from November 1893, when there was a personal letter here written from Ninito Sumner, who was a Tahitian princess, cousin to the Pomare family, who wrote a very personal, cordial letter. Nothing really political in there, but just like about inquiring, how are you, and, you know, how are you dealing with this awful situation that you're into, and, you know, just a very friendly kind of greeting here between again trying to maintain these Ari'i and Ali'i relationships here. And also interesting, it's a mix of Hawaiian and Tahitian, so that again shows you how close these languages are. And then people who are exposed to both, they end up actually not even switching from one to another, but just mixing them into a mixed language that's kind of half Tahitian, half Hawaiian. That's what this letter essentially is all about. Okay, now being kind of coming somewhat closer to the well, later part of my presentation. What's the legacies of all of this 19th century situation? Well, first of all, there are some interesting political legacies here. Just like not even a decade ago, the Prime Minister of Samoa, of the independent state of Samoa, Tuilaepa Sa'ilela Malielegaoi, he, together with several other leaders from Polynesian island states, they founded the Polynesian Leaders Group as a new kind of sub-regional organization in the South Pacific. And when this happened, he gave an interview to the Samoan newspaper Savali. That was for some reason right on Lakuakoa on November 28th, 2011. Whether Tuilaepa was aware of that, I don't know, but nonetheless, I think it's very interesting. Just gave me chicken skin when I saw it. It's like, whoa, this is on this very day that he says that. So he was describing that. He was, you know, showing them that he was very well aware of all of this. So it's not a new idea. It's not a new group. The idea of the Polynesian Confederation dates back to the 1880s, over 100 years ago. It was the height of imperialism in the Pacific, and he means Kalakaua. He says Kamehameha. He got that mixed up. But of Hawaii, King Pomare of Tahiti, Maliotualaupepa of Samoa, and King George Tupou of Tonga agreed to set up a confederation of Polynesian states at that time. Envoys from Hawaii were received here in Apia. Apia is in Samoa. He refers to that picture that we saw with Bush and on board the Kaʻimiloa, and agreements were signed. So here we got like a Polynesian politician from one of the independent states today, or like very recently, being fully aware of this. So it's using actually this as a precedent to have like a coming together of Polynesian leadership today. And then I think 1 year or 2 years later, actually Hawaii also had an gained observer status, and the Kamanaʻopono Crab, who was at that time the CEO of OHA, he was received there too. And this is the picture. Unfortunately, it's a super bad resolution. I don't have any higher resolution, but that shows like on the left Kamanaʻopono being there at that next leadership meeting. But of course, coming back to the title of my presentation, like the probably more well-known legacy of pan-Oceanian connections that really center Hawaii and Oceania is, of course, the revival of voyaging. Now, that to me is really important, because at the very time when Hawaii was probably politically more remote from the rest of Oceania than it ever was in the 1960s and 70s, that also is the very time when some smart people in Hawaii, including Herb Kane and others, developed this idea of wanting to revive traditional Polynesian navigation. And of course, the other main person in this was Maupiailuk from Micronesia. So here again, we have a very good example of how Micronesia is an important part of Oceania, and without Micronesia, Polynesian navigation, at least here in Eastern Polynesia, would not have been able to be revived. So again, something that people should think about before they say anything bad about Micronesians. And of course, the other important thing is that the PVS really was being the pioneer from starting in the 1970s, has then sparked a renaissance of traditional voyaging really virtually all over Oceania. So there is now, I don't know how many, probably at least a dozen different voyaging societies in virtually every island in the Pacific. You have like 4 or 5 of these waka in Aotearoa. You have in Cook Islands, I think 2 or 3. Samoa has now at least 1. Tonga is building 1, I think, right now. Fiji has 1 or 2. And then even in islands where there was more of the tradition, but it was more obscured, like in some of the Solomons and some of the Polynesian outliers, all of this has really sparked a renewed interest and also like a determination of those who are still practicing this now to perpetuate it. So this is really another interesting part of where Hawaii, as Americanized as it was in the 70s and as politically removed as it was from the rest of Oceania, it played this super important role. Just to point out these parallels and these kind of amazing connections there, and how like his history repeats itself. Just when I saw these 2 pictures, I just couldn't help but think about like this legacy of kind of vessels or like ships and orders. Yeah, you have here in 1887, John Bush from Hawaii awards the Order of the Star of Oceania to Maliotualaupepa. And then you have just like more than 100 years later, just recently during Hōkuleʻa's worldwide voyage, when they were in Tahiti, the Tahitian president, which is kind of like the governor of an American territory, like he's the kind of the head of the semi-autonomous government within the French colonial system there, but locally elected, Tahitian person. He awarded the Order of Tahiti Nui to Nainoa Thompson when he came. Of course, I think Nainoa Thompson needs any introduction here among you guys in Hawaii, so the head president of the Polynesian Voyaging Society. So I think this is like really interesting to see like how this, how history repeats itself in that sense. So before I finish, let's just go back to just once more reflect on this ship, the Kaʻimiloa. What does Kaʻimiloa mean? Like the search, to search deeply, the deep search, Kaʻimiloa. So the fact that Kalakaua gave that name to the ship, I think really was really important, because it meant much more than just a random Navy ship. It was not really that much about just Hawaii saying, oh, like we are recognized, we're like more westernized than you guys, whatever, we have all this fancy technology, so here we come. And that was maybe part of it, but I think it was much deeper than that. Like Kaʻimiloa, to really search, to go back into like to Hawaii's origins, to look into what was called kahiki, what the points of where the ancestors, at least of the major ali'i lines, came from. You know, so that is really something that I think Kalakaua was intending there, to do, like to connect Hawaii to really the deep history of Oceania. And it's also interesting that in his book, The Legends and Myths of Hawaii, King Kalakaua makes a very explicit statement that he considers kahiki from the Hawaiian historical traditions to be actually not Tahiti, which I guess phonetically makes more sense, but to actually specifically connect it to Samoa. That Kalakaua talks about that. And so for the origin, at least of Hawaii Island ali'i that he descended from, that there is this, that they come from Samoa, which then creates a very interesting implication, because then you have this Kaikua'ana and Kaikaina relationship, that the Samoan ali'i would be Hawaiian ali'i's older siblings, and therefore Hawaii as a Kaikaina has then this obligation to, especially during this period when some Samoan chiefs were under siege by Western imperialism. So I mean, all of this really feeds into why Kalakaua did this, why Kalakaua was so intent on sending a ship down to the rest of the Pacific and try to unite them. Also interesting is to briefly look into what happened afterwards, how important the Kaʻimiloa was as a symbol after the occupation of Hawaii by the US. So this is a first picture here is a title page from one of the Hawaiian newspapers from 1902, and under the headline Nahomana Okeaoihala, to think of the times past. And they put on this title page the picture of King Kalakaua. You barely see him, but it's in the center there on the bridge. He's inspecting the Kaʻimiloa before its departure to Samoa. So there they are, very like, you know, there's a sense of pride here that, you know, Hawaii is occupied, but you know, this is like really like, this is something our kingdom did, and we're going to print it again so that everybody knows it and nobody can deny it, as much as Dole and all these people are spewing their propaganda, but you know, here it is. Well, and then 10 years later, you have the counteroffensive. You have actually the propaganda offensive, when the Americans, being very aware of the symbolic value of this ship, they used that ship, and you know, it has been like sitting around in the harbor and rotting there for like almost 30 years by then. And they use that ship, or whatever remains of it, and they burn it publicly for 4th of July celebration. So I think the symbolic violence to the memory of Hawaii's Pan-Oceanianism couldn't be bigger than that. In order to celebrate an American national holiday, they burned the ship that was kind of the pride of the Hawaiian kingdom and the symbol of its leadership and its kind of solidarity with the rest of Oceania. But as the very fact that I'm doing this presentation, that I was able to write this book, that there were some other people like Kealani Cook, for example, David Chang, like there's various other scholars who are now focusing on these connections of Hawaii in the 19th century. The fact that we're doing this scholarship today, obviously, of course, means that, you know, the propaganda has failed. That this knowledge, this memory couldn't be suppressed. As much as propaganda has come from America in the last 100-something years. And but in order to come back to my title, why am I saying from the Hōkuleʻa to the Kaʻimiloa and back? Well, what I mean is that in a way we have kind of a circle here, a continuity of Kuleana. So we have ancient Polynesian navigation going back thousands of years with double-hulled canoes and star navigation. Then we use modern technology, 19th century Western technology, because it's, I guess, more efficient. You go quicker to Samoa with that ship than with it, and you can transport more people and whatever. So you have this, what Kamana Bima refers to as selective appropriation of Western technology. So then you have the Kaʻimiloa. You still do the same thing that an ancient canoe would have done, but you do it just with Western technology. And then 100 years later, we have a revival of the real traditional navigation. But of course, again, we use some Western technology. The thing is built out of fiberglass, not of wood. So we go kind of, we go from the old to the new, and then we go back to the old and the new. So it's kind of, it's kind of, everything comes full circle here, I think, with the Kaʻimiloa and the Hōkuleʻa. And the main point is there's this continuity here of Kuleana, of like Hawaii being in Oceania, Hawaii being part of Oceania, Hawaii having Kuleana in Oceania. So I think this is kind of the main topic, the main point I want to make. And just my last slide here, just to see how very recently this pan-Oceanian solidarity in action happened here. And this time really the other way around, like how a lot of, probably one of the first times in modern history and the recent history that I've seen so much active solidarity from other Oceanian people for Hawaii. And that's of course with Kukia'i Mauna, with the standing for Mauna Kea last year. And then this is a picture I took, and you see all these different flags. They have various delegations from, you have the flags here, Maori of Aotearoa, Independent Samoa, American Samoa, and Tonga. And at various points there have been various other flags from various parts of the Pacific Islands. And so there's this strong sense of solidarity. And then this is an interesting picture here of a local artist collective, Seleka in Nuku'alofa. Some of these were my friends while I was teaching in Tonga, and they actually made a mural on their little very modest little art shop in Tonga, with a bilingual inscription here, Kukia'i Mauna and Malu. Sorry, I can't read this right now because it's covered by my picture here. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Malu'ia Mauna Kea, which means to also the same thing, protect Mauna Kea. So I want to leave it at that and say mahalo. And because I'm based in Tahiti, honoring the Maori people of this land, Maururu in Tahitian. And then just a list of my archival sources here, because I want to be a responsible scholar, always cite my sources. And I'll leave it open for questions now. And thank you.
Mahalo, Dr. Gonschor. So while we wait for some questions, so please post your questions in the on the Facebook message, and hopefully I will get to it in the comments. But we do have a few actually from other panelists, and one of them was, what advice can you give to young scholars looking for primary sources that shed light on like these types of oceanic connections in the 19th century?
Well, that's a very complex question, because there is a lot of that, but it's very scattered. So, I mean, definitely, before getting these big research grants and whatever to go overseas, I think a good start, of course, is in Hawaii in the state archives, like foreign affairs, FO and X, like foreign office and executive, like a lot of these international, like foreign correspondence in the Hawaii archives. That would be a good starting point. Then the Bishop Museum has a lot of other materials that are not, if they're not directly related to the kingdom government, and even some of the government documents ended up in the Bishop Museum. So the Bishop Museum has a lot of that too. Even if you look at some of the oldest objects that the Bishop Museum has, some of the Samoan and Kiribati collections are actually the result of these Hawaiian diplomatic missions bringing stuff home from there. So that would be definitely Bishop Museum, State Archives, and also the Hawaiian Mission Children Society, which is right next to the Hawaiian Historical Society, because of a lot of the Hawaiians who were especially in Micronesia as missionaries, and a lot of them wrote back letters. So I would say, start in these three archives in Hawaii, and then once you get your specific, research topic together, maybe you focus on one specific country, then I would probably recommend going to that country. Fiji has a huge national archives that has like a lot of the correspondence concerning the Fijian kingdom. I still haven't gone through because I was there for only a relatively short period. Aotearoa has there's some very, very detailed collections there in Wellington, in the National Archives of Aotearoa, in the Turnbull Library, also in Auckland, in the Auckland University Library. So definitely Aotearoa has a lot of these resources. And then, of course, there is also not to neglect the big centers of the imperial powers that have, kind of, even though their interest was, of course, to counter all of this, but because some of them were very worried about it, they also kept track of that. And I mean, a lot of the German National Archives in Berlin report about many details of this because they're really worried about what Hawaii is doing there because it kind of endangered their own colonizing enterprise. And then the same thing with the National Archives of the UK in Kew in London, the French National Archives in Paris and in Aix-en-Provence. Of course, the US National Archives, both the ones in DC, but also the ones for the Pacific coast in San Bruno next to San Francisco. So, I mean, these were, I mean, obviously, I'm not recommending, I'm not saying that if you do like an MA thesis, you should go to all of these and ruin your finances for the rest of your life by doing all these trips. But I'm not saying that, but I mean, just, start in Hawaii, find the topic, or maybe one or two countries that you're specifically interested in that you think you have a lot of materials there that you need to look into, and then just do it and get the research grant to go to that particular country. That's how I would approach it.
So thank you for that. We have another question, and this is from Keamoku. So what are your thoughts of like self-determination for like a united Polynesian, united oceanic nation? Like, could that be done? Like, I guess maybe modeled after like a EU kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I mean, I think, I mean, that's of course, it's an open-ended project. I mean, in a way, it's more realistic nowadays than it was in the 19th century because, because Western imperialism overall is kind of on the wane now in the Pacific. For example, New Caledonia being currently French might become independent soon because they're having another referendum next 2 years from now. New Zealand might grant its last colony, Tokelau, independence or in free association soon. So I mean, I think there's some hope there that decolonization moves forward in certain parts of the Pacific. So I think, plus we're in a global geopolitical shift that the whole geopolitics of the entire world shifts from a US hegemony to a Chinese hegemony. And, in these hegemonic shifts, there's always a chance for if people are smart and they are able to maybe act and become self-determined, like there's always, remember what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed? There was a lot of countries and peoples in Eastern Europe that were able to get their freedom in the process of this switch from Russian to US hegemony, even though, I mean, I'm not fully in favor of the US hegemony that happened afterwards. But nonetheless, like if you have these global geopolitical shifts there's always a chance sometimes for smaller nations to come out in bigger force if they act swiftly and smartly. So that being said, I mean, I think it would be a good thing for the Oceanian peoples, for the Oceanian nations to unite more. And I mean, there are some tendencies for that to happen with some of these regional organizations like the Pacific Forum, like the Polynesian Leaders Group. Actually, I think the Melanesian countries are the ones who are currently the closest in doing it, with the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which has formed both a political alliance but also an economic alliance. They now have like a kind of a tax, like a duty-free, trade zone. They have like economic kind of investments from one country to another, like a very kind of coming somewhat close to what the EU is doing in Europe to some extent. So, I mean, it's not something that will happen overnight because, again, you still have like imperialist, you still have a lot of Western colonialism in the Pacific with the French, the Americans, little bit of the Australians, New Zealanders, and Chileans in Rapa Nui and others. But so you still have like, foreign colonialism in some parts of Oceania. And of course you have, I guess, Western economic neo-colonialism in some islands too. But, I think it's a work in progress. And I would say, it's something that, in the course of this century may be able to be achieved, but it's a complex question. I mean, I don't want to say like it will happen or it won't happen, but personally, I think it's a good idea, and there's also a lot of indicators of how it could be realized sometime this century. So.
Okay. We have one more kind of longer question. I know Lance was also going to post one, but so this is from Kahala Johnson. His question has to do with how white supremacy during the Trump administration continues to recruit pro-kingdom stances in ways that support fascist regimes and anti-Blackness in Oceania. And the examples for him were the use of High Hawai'i at Trump rallies, the rejection of BLM in contrast with Mauna Kea, or the supporting Mauna Kea, and also the strong Trump support from Oceanic communities with heavy Christian and conservative values. Considering these rising trends, what can advocates for deoccupation do to challenge these problems as they occur in the community so as not to reduplicate these problems in our fight for liberation? Just a real small question at the end.
No, that's a very, I mean, it's a long question, but it's a very valid, I think a very important question. I mean, a very great point that you made there, Kahala. That is, and I know you and I had a little bit of this conversation. I remember that last time on Mauna Kea when we last met, I think last year. So thank you for picking that up again. And yeah, I mean, I've been seriously concerned about these things too. I mean, there is a lot of kind of conservatism and Christian right-wing mentality among Pacific communities, and that is indeed very worrisome. I think one of the main points that I would say is, in order to counter that, is to look. I mean, one easy way of dismantling that discourse is that you look into, because some of these people, if they are kingdom advocates, then with this set of values, then they just focus on the 1840s. They just like think, oh, like this very early period when they're very strong, when people were freshly converted to Christianity, and this kind of Christian mindset was very strong. And, you know, they had in the 1840 constitutions things like the law has to, no law may contradict the will of our Lord Jesus Christ, or whatever, like our Lord Jehovah, like all these kind of theocratical things. But, you know, the way you dismantle these kind of people is by saying, well, look, I mean, that's a certain stage in the kingdom. But if you look at people like the later part, like the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s, I mean, of course, you still had, I mean, you have Christian conservatives too in the kingdom still during that time. But I mean, a lot of the kind of people that the leading, I would say the leading intellectuals of the kingdom were like very progressive people. They were like probably as progressive as you could be in the late 19th century. I mean, they were all for like secularizing, you know, dividing, like not having missionaries or Christian churches or any religious entities to have political power in the kingdom anymore, like secularizing education, secularizing the state, getting rid of all these kind of Christian theocratic things that were in the legal system before. So, I mean, the Hawaiian kingdom in the 19th century was, you know, as progressive as you could possibly be at that time. And to me, the only logical consequence of being kind of a pan-Oceanian kind of late Hawaiian kingdom supporter would be to be kind of a very progressive in all these social questions today. I think there's no other way that you can really, like, you know, you can I mean, and everything else is, to me, is very hypocritical, you know. And but it's true that there is like a lot of this kind of I think one other thing that needs to be fought against strongly, and that goes much beyond that, is that there is like a certain sense of Hawaiian and by extension also Polynesian exceptionalism, in the sense of, like, as Myla Arvin wrote a book recently about that. It's quite interesting about how in this kind of white supremacist system, and then that was developed by Western scholars in the 19th century, Polynesians always had this kind of honorary place where they were kind of almost white, like more than any other quote unquote race in the world. And it looks like that sometimes some Polynesians today, they are still kind of somewhat living in that mindset that they rather associate with white people than with other colored people. And for example, you know, the people that, I think that's also part of how some of this kind of looking down on Micronesians comes to be, because they're, like, I guess, somewhat darker than Polynesians are. Even more so with Melanesians. I mean, that's not so much an issue in Hawaii because there are very few Melanesians living in Hawaii, but I think you have a lot of kind of anti-Melanesian racism from both sides, from Austronesian speakers on both sides of Melanesia. You have Polynesians looking down on Melanesians as being dark, and you have, of course, Malay and Indonesian people looking down on Melanesians for the same reason, like in like that whole West Papua issue, for example. So yeah, that is definitely something that, you know, needs to be called out, needs to be analyzed historically. The origins of it need to be, you know, exposed. Yeah, I think it's all a matter of education. I mean, just like, you know, just like most Trump supporters or like right-wing kind of fanatics in general, most of them get drawn into these movements because they're uneducated. I mean, of course, you have the people who lead these movements, who are educated, who are smart and really evil educated people. But, you know, a lot of the masses who fall for this kind of right-wing fascism and whatever are people who are just not well educated. So to me, I mean, especially with like people of color falling for this kind of fascist propaganda, I think, you know, education, you know, is really the key, you know, to show how to show the history of white supremacy, to show how white supremacy has kind of divided people of color by creating these kind of racial hierarchies that put Polynesians further up than Melanesians or black people, for example. So, you know, I mean, that to me is, I guess it was a very long talk now, but I mean, I guess the key of it, I think, education, you know, educating people about how these things came to be, and then just dismantle these structures by exposing their origins and deconstructing their origins.
Thank you for that.
We sometimes, when people leave long comments, we also just read them, and if you have a reaction or you don't have a reaction, it's fine. And so there was one from Ulisse Funaki, who wrote, Malo Lorenz e fua fa tongia ma ai kakai me vaihi ma mao moe kakai e moana vavale. So I don't know if that's worthy of a reaction or not, but it was more than just many of the mahalo that have been posted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Malo Alpito, thank you for that comment. For that was a very extensive way of thanking me. As far as I have, my Tongan is not fluent. I mean, I'm pretty fluent in Hawaiian and Tahitian. My Tongan is not that fluent, but that's how I understood. Like he's thanking me for sharing all this different knowledge about the connection between Hawaii and Tonga. But yeah, so thank you very much for. I always appreciate if people. I mean, I appreciate if people appreciate my research, of course. And I mean, that's what I mean. That's what I'm most thankful at. If people from the communities in the Pacific appreciate and maybe get inspired to do their own research and, you know, pick up where I left to take it to the next level. So thank you. Malo Apito.
You set the bar high. And so, yeah, thank you so much for taking time out. I know you got a virtual stack of papers, and we appreciate all of your time. And
of course,
yeah, I encourage you to go back to look at the comments. They're mostly very appreciative. So good luck with your work, Dr.
And where can folks get your book?
My book, well, I would say, you know, because there's a certain big international company that has made so much money out of this COVID crisis that I don't really want to publicly say you should order your book there. But if you're in Hawaii, especially if you're on Oahu, go to Native Books Namea Hawaii, they should have it. But I mean, you know, if you just Google the book, you find that there's various online sellers. Of course, the big one that I just talked about, but also probably other smaller online booksellers that
and also UH Press, right?
Of course, the UH Press website itself, of course. Sorry, I forgot. I mean, I forgot to mention my own editor here. Of course, yeah, that's of course the first place to go. Of course, is go to the UH website and order it right there at the University of Hawaii Press UH Press website. Of course, that's probably the easiest of them all. Yes, of course.
Thanks, Lance. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gonschor, and good night to everybody.
Of course. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Aloha.
Yeah, thank you.